Thanks for joining me on the Power Hour, everyone. I'm your host, Gene Schatzman. Quick reminder to subscribe on YouTube, Spotify, or Apple Podcasts so you can get updated every time we have a new episode. So for today's show, I bring on a guest who has some pretty insightful perspectives on metrics that you should think about in your practice and how you can use those metrics to grow. And we go beyond the obvious. And just to give a little bit of context, Dr. Chris Wolfe runs iCode Education. He also sees patients 3 days a week. He also founded a company that helps optometrists study for their board. So one thing I found fascinating is how Chris adapted things that you have to memorize for the boards, like prevalence of various conditions, for example, to help determine if you're missing opportunities in your practice. You'll have to listen to the episode to understand what you mean. But we peel back the onion on common metrics like revenue per patient and go much deeper into things like revenue per OD hour. And then we end up discussing patient lifetime value or even allowable acquisition cost for various conditions. We also talk about the appropriate psychology for both the OD and the patient in the chair when you're turning managed care exam, for example, into a complete treatment program for just about any condition. We use dry eye in our example, but I really think it extrapolates well. Anyway, the conversation with Chris was pretty fast paced. And for previous shows, I've gotten lots of listeners reaching out and asking for things like exact wording, tips with exactly how you say something in the chair. So Chris did exactly that for us. He gave us his wording for certain types of patient conversations that help drive both better patient outcomes, but also better practice revenue. So I'm excited to hear what you think of the episode. And as always, if you want to reach out, please do so. You can reach me at eugeneschatzman.com or on the Power Hour website. By the way, the Power Hour is owned by the Power Practice. Power Practice is a premier consulting group. It helps practice owners achieve freedom of time, also helps practice owners solve complex issues in their practice and grow. And now let's jump into today's show. All right, Chris Wolfe, welcome to the Power Hour. Happy to have you here.
Hey, Eugene, thanks for letting me jump on. I appreciate the opportunity.
Yeah, well, so I think that you have such a unique perspective on specifically practice metrics and the way that you approach this. And we're going to get into this topic in just a few minutes. But I think it's important for people to understand the vantage point that your perspective is coming from. So maybe just give everybody a minute or two of your background so that it's clear where all this expertise is going to be founded in.
Thanks, Eugene. So, well, I mean, just to give you a kind of a high-level overview of where I come from, I spent about 8 years helping doctors and students prepare for board examinations, and so that kind of helps kind of solidify. Well, we're memorizing this and applying that, and so when you think about like how do you manage ocular disease, that's what we're teaching people in school, and they're preparing for boards. But then how do we actually apply that in practice where there's a comprehensive care model where patients are being delivered to our practice for kind of primary and comprehensive care needs? And then managing all of these other disease states is really complex. And so what we found within iCode Education is that when you don't have when you have the knowledge to manage a disease, but you don't have the way to integrate it into a practice whereby a patient is 65 years old and has glaucoma suspect risk and has macular degeneration and has dry eye, and oh, by the way, they need new glasses and contact lenses, and they have a managed vision care plan that they want to use. If you can't do that, then you're left sort of wavering and waffling in a practice. And that's what we really help people with. And so I think my background related to helping people prepare for boards gives me a really deep understanding of the ocular diseases and the binocular vision diseases or disorders that we encounter in a comprehensive care practice. And then working and seeing how that works in a practice and practices that do those things well. And then practices that struggle with them, we really can kind of find like, how do we work this into a practice so that the patients have access to the care that we have the knowledge, education, and training to provide?
Yeah, so and I think that's fantastic. And one of the things that I want to talk about today is this kind of concept of finding untapped or underleveraged potential in your practice. And what I like about the way that you approach things is that you approach it through data and prevalence. And let's zoom in a little bit on that. What kind of data should practice owners be looking at if we're starting to kind of peel back the onion layer by layer? Let's pick one and let's think about some metrics that are relevant.
Well, one of the things I think is important is that the first thing is I will pick one, but the one that I want to start with is one that a lot of people are already used to thinking about, and that is revenue per patient, often called revenue per exam, or I like to call it revenue per refraction. And the reason I think we have to start there is because that's a classic KPI that most people are measuring. Most people can think about that data right away.
Of course.
But the downside of just using that is it links all of your services, anything that's going to generate revenue in your practice, it only links it to a refraction. There's a good thing. I mean, it's a good metric to have, but it links that refraction largely to the sale of something else. So it's kind of incomplete, because what we will see happen is if you only understand that number, then anything that deviates or detracts from your refractions, in theory, or the sale of something that can come from the refraction, i.e. contact lenses or glasses, can sort of be looked at as like, well, if my number is really high, if I'm selling a really expensive pair of glasses, let's say that number is I do a refraction and all I do is comprehensive care. I do a refraction, I sell an expensive pair of glasses, then that number is, let's say, 1,000, right? $1,000. And I'm really excited about that number. If I have to deliver care that doesn't result in the sale of glasses or contact lenses and doesn't rotate or circle around a refraction, anything less than $1,000 seems like, well, I could be doing the thing that drives $1,000. And so that number is really important to optometric practices, but it's also incomplete when we think about the disease state management. So that's the first thing we have to think about. The second number that I think is important is how then can I compare, Eugene, the time it takes for me to see a patient for a comprehensive exam, perform a refraction, and then my staff can sell them glasses, versus the time it takes for me to perform a comprehensive exam, identify an ocular disease, then see that patient for the ocular disease. What time does it take for me to see that patient for an ocular disease? And how can I relate the two? Because they're not easily relatable through the metric of refraction. Does that make sense?
Well, so how's that different than like revenue per doctor hour or something?
Well, that's
like
what you need to. That's what you need to know. You need to know revenue per doctor hour, because it allows you to compare apples to oranges, right? So the thing that a lot of people think about is incomplete, which is revenue per patient or revenue per refraction. But what they should be thinking about is that plus revenue per OD hour. So imagine that I'm seeing. I want to maximize the revenue per patient, right? I want to see one patient one time a year, perform one refraction, and sell a really expensive pair of glasses. That's awesome. But let's say I only want a select number of patients where I'm going to see, let's say, 5 patients a day or 7 patients a day. And I want to really give that patient a customized experience. But wait, I'm in the office for 8 hours a day. So if I'm in the office for 8 hours a day, seeing 7 patients, giving them a really great experience, they're buying a nice pair of glasses, then my revenue per refraction super high, right? Let's say it's $1,000. That's $7,000 if I'm seeing 7 patients.
Mm-hmm.
But the problem is that, at some point, we're going to cap out. We're going to think about other ways to grow, and we may not actually be serving our patients' entire needs when you look at prevalence data. And that's where revenue per hour, revenue per OD hour comes in play. Is it allows me to say, okay, well, I might be seeing 7 patients in an 8-hour day. That each one of them is generating $1,000, but I'm still only, in that 8-hour day, I'm generating less than $1,000 an hour. What could there be a model where I see, let's say 12 patients a day? I can still give a really good experience to that patient, who I'm giving a refraction, but I'm also seeing an additional 5 patients a day where I'm diving deeper into their dry eye or deeper into their glaucoma. And it's not detracting from the original experience I'm giving to the patient, but it's also adding to the revenue that I'm producing over the entire day. And that's why revenue per OD hour is important. And so maybe now, instead of generating $7,000 a day, I'm generating $9,000. So my per hour revenue is higher. But how do we actually capture that? And so that's kind of the second piece that I think is really important, because now I can compare how much revenue am I generating per hour in any time piece. Let's say also, Eugene, that those extra 5 patients only took me 10 minutes of time, right? So now I'm generating $2,000 for an additional 5 patients where each of them took 10 minutes of time. Would I deny that extra revenue? And most importantly, would I deny those patients from having that disease managed in our office, right?
Right. So I
And
see
that's
how
why it's
that's
helpful.
I see how that starts driving decision making inside the office as well, and how you get to kind of select, well, what kind of practice do I want to run? But ultimately, I have to optimize for something. And so obviously, every metric has has another metric that kind of competes with it for priorities. So it sounds to me like you're kind of arguing for optimizing for revenue per OD hour as a potential metric to look at, especially if you've got owners who practice inside the practice potentially. Um, but then I also wonder, there are practices out there that really do want to maximize revenue per patient, and they focus on like outside RX and things like that, where they really value their optician's time, and or they really leverage their optician's time and almost not so much the optometry time. So I think there's obviously competing priorities in almost any practice, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And I don't think that one of those KPIs is more important than the other. I think it just allows us to get different perspective on what the business is doing.
Sure.
And and so like, they do play into each other, but I wouldn't say one is more important. But what's important about the second is that a lot of people, Eugene, don't think about it. You actually have to kind of pull it out of them. Well, they'll say things like, well, I could have spent, if I've got to manage a patient with glaucoma as an example, moderate glaucoma, it's not necessarily easy to manage moderate glaucoma if you don't have systems built around that. But they'll say, well, if I could have generated, if it took me, let's say 30 minutes of my time, I'm going to go on a higher end, right? Just so we can kind of tilt it on the side of in favor of the refractive care, right? So I'm going to tilt it in favor of that. But let's say it takes me 30 minutes for a comprehensive exam and refraction. It takes me 30 minutes to manage a complex patient, or complex patient who has moderate glaucoma. Well, what a lot of people will say is, well, I could have done the same thing. I could have just provided another comprehensive exam, and on average, I would have generated more money on average. But what I would say is, well, if you're looking at time, and actually if you look at time, even in those half-hour increments, and you're doing all the things that our clinical practice guidelines recommend that we ought to be doing for a patient with moderate glaucoma, namely visual fields, gonioscopy, OCTs, and you're doing them within that half hour or less, the revenue per hour is almost as good in most cases, and in many cases it's better than what you're generating for that half hour of time providing an exam and refraction. And so it allows us to the little thing in the back of our brain that says my main value is I get to sell you a pair of glasses, right? I'll take a managed vision care plan that doesn't pay me very well, griping about it, but I have the opportunity to sell you a pair of glasses,
Mm-hmm.
which is now the big piece, which is in the back of our minds all the time. And it allows me to say, no, if I'm spending a half hour on average with these patients and my capture rate is 60% or 40%, I can know how much revenue I'm actually generating on average for that amount of time. And then I can compare it to the amount of time I'm spending with the patient who has glaucoma.
Well,
And
and
then,
what's interesting is
yeah,
that the glaucoma patient is going to return multiple times. So if you think about revenue per patient over time, or as I like to talk about, a lifetime value of a patient, you're probably going to get more from the glaucoma patient, or the moderate glaucoma patient over time. And that, of course, then drives another business metric that I love, which is allowable acquisition cost. Because if you
well,
think about what
tell me
if
about
I
that.
so imagine, if I have a patient who just spent $1,000 in my office, and they spent that $1,000 on glasses. Well, let's think about this. They're likely to come back in the next 18. So let's just say they're going to come back, and we'll go best case scenario. They're going to come back in a year, and they're going to be around for 4 years. So
But
that
you know the
patient,
average though. So pause on that, because you know the average time so let's say best case they come back in a year, but what's the average time they come back for a new pair of glasses?
22 months, right?
22 months.
So we know that. and
Yep.
we know that data. So I'm giving you a high end average, but actually let's go with your 22 months. So and the average patient sticks around for maybe 4 years, but it really depends on what kind of practice you're running. If it's rural versus urban versus with a suburb. And let's just call it 4 years. So, okay, fine. That patient will be back 3 times in the next 4 years in that number. So, okay, so now that patient has spent $3,000 with me, and assuming that they buy the same high end $1,000 glasses every time they come back. Now, that basically means to me, okay, what is my allowable acquisition cost for that patient? I have to pick a percentage of my profit. So what's my profit? Well, I have cost of goods on those glasses and lenses. Let's just call them, I don't know, 30%. What do you think?
Mm-hmm. That's fair. Yep,
Fair.
that's fair.
So
But then you have to include your staff costs, right?
of course, right.
Yep.
Well, but I don't know my staff costs. I can't necessarily attribute them to every single transaction. So I'm going to say, okay, I've got my staff. Maybe I'll attribute the OD production cost. So maybe I'll take 20% or something and attribute my OD production
Yep.
cost to that. So I've got 30% for materials, 20% for OD. Trying to make it easy. So 50%. So that patient spent $3,000 in my office, or I'm assuming that the lifetime value of that patient is $3,000. I now have, so I probably have $1,500 of quote profit, right? This is
Yep.
variable, a variable cost, meaning we're what would minus our variable cost. This is incremental cost. If a new patient walked in tomorrow and I didn't have to do anything, extra, I didn't have to pay more rent. I didn't have to pay more utilities. I didn't have to pay more front desk. That patient just walked in the door. That patient would be worth an extra $1,500 to my practice over the next 4 years. Now, I have to take a discount factor and say how big of a discount factor and how aggressive do I want to be, and how confident am I that that patient's actually going to stick around for 4 years, and how confident am I that that patient's going to come back in general. And so I have to pick a number, right? And usually marketers pick a number anywhere from 10 to 25% of that profit to say, okay, well, that's your allowable acquisition cost. So now I got $1,500. So let's go on the low end, 10, I can spend $150 to acquire that patient. Now, if I'm really confident that that patient is going to come back, and if I'm really confident, so I'm really confident in my recall, and I may be even more confident that that patient is going to come back more often, not 22 months, and I'm pretty confident that I can retain them for a while, and I'm pretty confident that they're going to buy every single time they come back, then maybe I'll shoot for like 20%. In my allowable acquisition cost, but in general, most practices are okay at 10%. But flip that whole equation for your glaucoma patient. Do the same, do the same marginal cost analysis on your glaucoma patient. So, my visual field, what does it cost me to run?
Oh, well, you've already acquired the. I mean, so
Right.
you've
So
acquired
marginal cost, zero.
right. Right.
Any other testing, there's no click fees,
Yeah.
right? So zero. Maybe
Yep.
just staff time, but whatever. You still have some OD production potentially that you would pay for. So now I'm dealing with 80% margin on probably something relatively similar to, maybe not quite $1,000, but let's just call it $1,000. And how often is that patient going to come back in the next 4 years?
Yeah. I mean, they're going to come back. They're going to come back. Let's say the moderate glaucoma patient. Let's say they're a stable moderate glaucoma patient, and they're very stable. Let's say it's every 6 months, right? Every 6 months, they're going to be back,
Like clockwork.
and yeah, like clockwork.
Be-
They're not waiting until they're glad. And now that's interesting because it will actually mess up your revenue per patient a little bit. So like, let's say, you see that patient back in that system, and annually you provide a refraction for them just so that you can make sure that when they do want, if and when they do want new glasses, they have an up-to-date prescription. And so, you see them at 6 months, and then you see them again at a year. Now you're doing another refraction. You see them in another 6 months. You do another year. Well, they're getting refractions every year, but they may not even be thinking about, because if the average is 22 months, they may get 2 refractions before they actually buy 1 pair of glasses. So that metric, now you're looking at revenue per, or capture rate. And, you talk to people and their capture rates are 70, 80%. But in this model, your capture rate might not be 70, 80%. It might be 50%, it might be 40, it might be 30%. And that still could be really good.
Right. Which might be completely fine, because and I'd always talk to practices with high instances of medical patients, you expect your overall capture rate to be lower, but This is where the lifetime value of the patient, which is different
Correct.
than revenue per patient, but the lifetime value of the patient could actually be higher because medical patients tend to come back in a more reliable fashion. And then, of course, you do the allowable acquisition cost, and what you could spend to acquire that patient profitably for your practice is actually a lot more than the
Hmm.
high-end glasses patient, which is what we're all after, right? So it's kind of a
Yeah.
little bit of a dichotomy there
Interesting.
too.
Yep. No, I think that is not clearly. I mean, as you talk about it, it's clearly something that I haven't thought about as the acquisition cost of that, but it's applicable for sure.
No, and if anybody has space in their schedule, then you should be thinking about patient acquisition. And if you're intelligently thinking about patient acquisition, then you should be thinking about, well, what should I be willing to spend profitably in my practice to fill that slot?
Yeah.
And arguably, you would just look at the marginal cost of what's the incremental cost. What does it cost me in addition to bring a patient into the practice to be able to perform that procedure, and how much risk do I have, and how likely am I to retain that patient?
When you work with people, sorry, I'm not trying to take over the interview, Eugene, but when you work with people, um, I call it the dopamine hit. But I'd love to hear your experience on, let's say two. What is your sense about two patients walk into the office, brand new patients to the office? One of those patients in a comprehensive care practice, one of those patients has a complaint of, let's say, we'll use dry eye, but let's say they have a complaint of a dry, scratchy, gritty eye, or even a red eye, just an acute red eye. That's a brand new patient versus a brand new patient who has a managed vision care plan and wants and is thinking about buying new glasses. I will tell you as much. Well, do you think there's a difference in how those practices see those patients, approach those patients, and value those patients?
Well, I think that if you do the right amount of discovery, you can take the managed care patient and you can turn that patient into a dry eye patient as well, some percentage of the time, right? If you do a good job of taking the time to go through and understanding everything that you could serve that patient, everything that your practice offers that could ultimately serve the full spectrum of everything that patient needs. I do agree with you that a quote dry eye patient is more desirable to a practice because they're predisposed and they're there and they have the problem, and they're more likely to say yes if we present them with a treatment plan because they have a problem and they're problem aware, and they're ready for the solution, right? That's why I think practices treat that patient as more desirable. But I also think that if you're playing the long game, which I think all of us are, if we've been around for a while, we try to play the long game of business. If you're trying to play the long game of business, the reality is that that same VSP patient will develop if you treat them in the right way, and if you do all the discovery work correctly in your practice. You're not just there for a quick, uh, spin and grin plus, like go check out the optical. If that's not your approach, which most practices it's not, right? Like you're trying to take care of the patient in the most preeminent way possible. In that case, that patient can also become can have high lifetime value. It may just take some serious work, some sales cycle, and some time to get there.
Yeah, I mean, you're articulating the point that I would make. I actually think that a patient, and I kind of tilted my hand by saying that patient with the acute problem was a dry eye patient, but I probably should have articulated it better. That like they just have a problem, right? They have a problem that it's not related to a refraction, and then they just need you to take care of it. I think most people, because they're not aware of the fact that like that patient they're aware of the acute problem, right? But they're like, the acute problem, I'll just solve that problem and then go away. I want to get to the patient that could buy glasses. But I couldn't agree with you more
Right.
that both of those instances, whether that's the patient that comes in and says, I have dry eye, I needed you to do something. People will be like, yeah, I'm going to take care of the dry eye. But and that's where the next KPIs that you and I have discussed briefly before is, okay, that patient that does come in with a managed vision care and is primarily concerned about needing new glasses. You said if you do what was it, your detection?
Discovery.
Your discovery work. I like that. I like that term. So if you think about that patient and what their likely diseases that they have are, right? Just based on prevalence data. And I always like to joke that we didn't memorize for boards prevalence data just so we could get boards questions, right? We memorized those things so that we could actually apply it to our patient population and know, okay, a 43-year-old Caucasian male sits down in front of me, what's he most likely to have? And I'll tell you, if you think about it, like we can start rattling off prevalence data. And I've done this, like 12.7% of patients over the age of 40 have macular degeneration. 2.1% actually have glaucoma. And when we look at all the glaucoma risk factors, you can easily, Caucasian patients over the age of 40, 2.1%, Beaver Dam eye study. So if you look at all the risk factors that go into that patient having glaucoma, you're probably thinking that patient's a glaucoma suspect at least 10% of the time. And probably if you really apply it completely, you could get higher numbers. And any other ethnicity that is not Caucasian, that number goes up. Beaver Dam eye study. So you start to whittle those things away. Dry eye, we talk low end, 35% of the population over the age of 35. But if you throw in meibomian gland dysfunction and Demodex, now we're talking probably 70%. And so you have these conversations in front of an audience, and everybody's like, yeah, all these patients have dry eye. And then you look at metrics about, okay, well, how many anterior segment photos do you bill per refraction? Blank face. Nobody has any idea. Okay, well, how many visual fields do you run? Because if you all agree with me that 10% of the population over the age of 40 that's Caucasian is a glaucoma suspect, then all you have to do is look to our clinical practice guidelines to say, well, clinical practice guidelines tell us for glaucoma suspects, they get an annual gonioscopy, an annual visual field, an annual OCT, right? That's what they tell us to do. So it's not me telling you that. And so everybody would say, nobody would argue with that, right? Nobody argues with that. So why aren't you doing 10 visual fields for every 100 refractions you do? Like, why isn't that a metric that you're looking at, right? So anyway, that's what's really fun, is to actually look at that as a KPI. And that's sort of peripherally related to what we were talking about. I don't know how I got there exactly.
This is great, and it's kind of brilliant if you think about it. And the prevalence data is really like, that's the real benchmark, right? To say, well, okay, so I saw X number of patients in my practice, and X number of them, percentage of them were over 40, and I treated 5% of them for anything to do with dry eye. But the prevalence data says that 75% of them had something that I could have helped them with, like you said, blepharitis, Demodex, or dry eye.
Meibomian gland dysfunction.
Right.
Yep.
Right. In some capacity, I could have helped them. So let's talk more about that. So how do you make that practical? How does somebody actually take action?
Well, really, it comes down. I think the first thing is it comes down to belief. So when we work with people, I mean, it seems kind of silly and sort of like Tim Robbinsy or Tony Robbinsy, but really, it comes down to like, what's your identity? And if you think that if your identity is that I'm just an optometrist, or, I can do some dry eye, but I don't have all the widgets, I don't have the RF, I don't have the low level light, I don't have the IPL, I'm just, so the first thing is like, if patients pick up on that. So it's kind of this like, no, I'm the best place for dry eye in my community. If a patient has dry eye, I'm going to be able to identify it, and I'm going to be able to take care of it. And believe me, optometrists are that way. They just need to have the confidence. So like, is their identity like solid, that I do not want a patient to walk into my practice with dry eye or meibomian gland dysfunction? Is their identity like, that can't happen, that I'm going to miss it, right? Mm-hmm. Like if that's their core, that's the first starting point. Like, I'm not going to miss this. When a patient comes in needing glasses, I'm going to pull the slit lamp away, and I'm going to be able to, I've already identified some symptoms or signs where I can confidently say, Eugene, great news. I've got a new prescription for you today. And that's going to make you see better up close because you're 43. I don't know. How old are you?
40.
40. Okay. You're 40. Because you're 40, and I'm going to make it a lot easier for you to see your computer during the day. That's going to help with the headaches. But you were also telling me that your vision fluctuates a little bit, and you rub your eyes, and so what I'm seeing in my clinical exam is that et cetera, you've got telangiectatic vessels, you've got stagnant oils in your tears, and the most common reason for this is that you've got an overgrowth of microorganisms. So I'm going to start you on warm compresses and lid scrubs, and I'm going to see you back in a month. Like that's the practical, like, and you have to believe that if you don't do that, Eugene next year is going to come back in, or in 22 months, he's going to come back in for another pair of glasses. And then in 22 months, he's going to come back in another pair of glasses. And at some point down the road, Eugene's eyes are going to be so uncomfortable that he's tried all the other things, artificial tears, he's gone here, he's bought this stuff on Amazon, but his disease state is so bad now that it's really hard to manage. And if I wasn't really paying attention to the easy stuff, it's going to be really hard for me to pay attention to Eugene when he's got, mild neurotrophic keratitis and 3+ SBK, or even 2+ SBK, and 4+ telangiectatic vessels, and no meibomian gland secretions. That's a lot harder of a case, right?
Mm-hmm.
But if I believe that it's important, if my core identity is Eugene is not coming into my office at 40 years old with even early dry eye or early meibomian gland dysfunction that I will miss and not be intentional about finding and following and managing, then at some point Eugene is going to have a worse disease state. And so I think that's the first step, right? The first step
So it's really that shifting that mindset. And by the way, I think I've interviewed 4 people on the show who have really echoed the same exact point, is that it really is about making sure that you see your relationship with the patient in a way that ultimately allows you to be a formal authority on this topic, as opposed to just making some recommendations and hoping they buy something. This is this really, and even the way you delivered it was with authority, right? Like you just, hey, so I'm prescribing this, I'm prescribing this, I'm prescribing this, and you're going to do this, this, and this, right? And I think Paul Karpecki was on the show, and he said, and I love when he said it. He said, "This concerns me.
Yeah.
I have a concern." When a doctor's concerned, all of a sudden you want to, you perk up a little bit. And so, that language is like, okay, this is a concern that I have. And so I'm making, I'm not making a recommendation. I'm just telling you what to do about this particular concern. I'm prescribing the following treatment. So I think that's the, that is a mindset shift, as you called it. And I think it makes perfect sense, Chris, that we would start there. But where do we go next?
Yeah. So the next thing that you do is you say, okay, well, I'm bought in, but how do I know if I'm making any movements? So the first thing is like, okay, well, what are the things that I talk about this all the time? Like, what can you not turn away from? So remember, if the patients are largely delivered into our practices through a comprehensive exam and refraction, then what questions do I ask that patient? If it's about dry eye, we can do a whole other set with glaucoma and macular degeneration because they're also very prevalent. But if it's dry eye, I'm sure people are getting sick of dry eye. We could do the same thing for anterior basement membrane dystrophy, by the way, like, or keratoconus.
Yeah, sure.
But if we're thinking about dry eye, we're thinking about like what questions, because guess what, with the coding rules that we have from 2021 and beyond, there's no counting HPIs, there's no counting review of systems, there's no counting past family social histories. You ask the history that is important for you to manage the patient. You ask the medically appropriate history. Well, guess what? If I've got a disease state that is prevalent in 70% of my population, right? Even if it was 35% of my population, then I'm going to ask at the comprehensive exam the questions that matter for that disease state. And I want questions that like I can't turn away from. This is the other part of it, is like, so the second step you asked is like, what's the next action? You really need to think about what are the questions that I'm going to ask, or question that I'm going to ask during a comprehensive exam, that if I get a yes to, I don't even care about anything else. So one for dry eye, there's 4 questions in my practice, and these are not groundbreaking. If you talk to any other expert, they're probably going to tell you the same thing. It's, do you ever use drops in your eyes? Are your eyes ever red? Does your vision ever fluctuate? Are your eyes ever gritty, burny, or itchy? Right? Those are the 4 questions. And you have to believe the answers to those questions for symptoms are so important that when you pull the slit lamp away, you will act. And the action isn't going to be, here, Eugene, try these artificial tears. The company just dropped them off yesterday, and if they don't work, let me know next year, or give me a call, or whatever. Like, that can't happen, right? It's, Eugene, this is the next best step. Because you had one of those things, I will not turn away from it. This is the next thing we're going to do. And Okay, here's the next key. I will see you back in 1 month or 2 weeks, or it doesn't matter. Like, you're so committed that that patient has a problem that you're going to act. And that's why those questions are so important. They're not important. The questions that I gave you are not important. Like, you shouldn't steal those questions, in my opinion. Whatever the question has to be, the answer has to be so important to you that you will act, right?
Mm-hmm.
You will act on that symptom. So you got to build that list of questions that you're asking those patients at the comprehensive exam, so that when you see a yes, you have to do something. Because guess what? If you don't believe in those questions that much, what's going to happen? You're going to get behind. And so the next patient's going to come in, and you got 2 patients long, and you're like, well, I can get to this next year. Same thing happens with visual fields. Like, the reason our visual field utilization is so low is because, Sally's gone and our visual field tech is gone. So I'm going to do it next year. Or the machine, it's kind of cumbersome and I'm running behind. Let's just get it next year. So it has to be that important. So that's step 2. You got to have questions on your intake or from your techs, that when the patient responds positively to those questions, you are going to own that the responsibility for doing something about it.
Got it. So, and when you talk about that, owning that responsibility, let's just get actually. I'm curious, when you bring that
Yeah.
patient back in 2 weeks and a month, what happens at that? What happens at that exam?
Yeah, great. I mean, a great question. If we're talking about dry eye, right? If we're talking about ocular surface disease, then I would have a much more. So the thing I think you're getting at, Eugene, is the idea that there is a distinctly different exam for a problem focused exam than a comprehensive exam. And what a lot of offices or a lot of doctors who are kind of in this comprehensive focused care, where we do everything at one visit and only do what we need to do at that visit. And if it's dry eye, I'll dress it a little bit, but I'm going to do it all at that visit. If it's glaucoma, I'll get it all at the visit. What you're asking about is, how is this next follow-up diving deeper? And so in my practice, what it looks like is I'm looking for specific things. I'll look for a standardized symptom score. I use SPEED, but you could use OSDI.
Sure.
There's some DEQ, some whatever you like. But a standardized symptom questionnaire allows me to dive deeper. I can talk more about why I like that further if you'd like, but that's different. That feels different for the patient. It is different. We get lab tests. So we get tier chemistry tests with MMP9s. We look at osmolarity. We look at lactoferrin. We look at mybography, right? We look at structure. And all of those, by the way, Eugene, have billable codes, which then become trackable if I'm thinking about metrics and KPIs about how many of these am I finding in compared to a refraction.
Mm-hmm.
And then all we talk about, and then I look for, so I'm looking for tear volume, I'm looking for tear instability, I'm looking for any other signs of inflammation, and then I want to see what those oil glands look like, right? So I will express oil glands, and I'll also look at secretions, right? So the difference between secretions and then expressions. I'm looking for other like masqueraders, right? So we're looking for things like, lid apposition, ectropion, entropion. We're looking for things like, incomplete lid closure. And honestly, these are things that I wouldn't normally do on a comprehensive exam because they're not that high yield. But there are some things in the comprehensive exam that are high yield that, again, that even if the patient doesn't have symptoms, that you're like, we got to do something about this.
Mm-hmm.
So that's how it feels different to the patient. That's how it is different in our practice. But we're intentional because we're looking for things that, like, if I have a positive MMP9 finding, my treatment approach is going to be different in a patient who has, let's say, has obstructions in their meibomian glands and a positive MMP9 finding. I know my treatment will be different for that patient than one who doesn't have, other signs of inflammation.
Mm-hmm.
But a lot of people don't think through like that, okay, well, if I see this is what I'm likely to do. Or if I see this is what I'm likely to do. So I encourage that as well. We actually work with people on building that out.
Well, what I heard you say that I think kind of what was even kind of the opener for this whole thing is that at the comprehensive exam, you didn't say something like, it looks like you have some symptoms related to dry eye. I'm recommending a thorough dry eye examination, and my staff will give you some information about it up front if you want to schedule it, right? Like, at that point, it's choice, and it's a choice that you're not really that behind. So with your whole concept of the mindset, you said, I'm going to tell you to do X, Y, and Z, and I would like to see you, or you said, and I'm going to see you back in a month.
Yeah.
And that's your dry eye exam billed medically, and potentially a treatment protocol that then follows.
Yeah, it's kind of a Jedi mind trick, you know what I mean? You're just like, and I will see you back in a month. And the reality is, the reason that you do that is it's really in the patient's best interest. That you're removing this sort of like decision point. If you think about like Business Made Simple, Don Miller, right? Like I'm sure you know all about what he does, and you're removing this like barrier of like, well, I have to analyze whether or not I should come back. Or how do I come back? Well, what's the steps? If this is okay, how do I know it's okay? Should I just use these drops and I'm feeling better and so I'm done? I don't have to come back. Like, no, I don't care if you're feeling better, and I do care, but like the decision point on whether or not you should come back, it's not about your symptoms, because there's so much more. Again, I believe there's so much more to dry eye than a patient's symptoms. So I'm removing that barrier for them. And you would be shocked at how many times that script right there, again, and it's a script, but that script right there gets bumbled around. And if you haven't really thought about it and practice it and said it over and over and over again, like doctors will try it and they're kind of like, they just are just not comfortable with it, right? The other thing it does is it forces you to get better, because those patients will come back and a lot of them will be marginally or minimally better. So imagine I give you artificial tears and you say, yeah, this is a little bit better, but it's not totally better, but I don't really have a scheduled follow-up, so I'm okay. I'll just wait till next year.
Right. 22 months later.
Yeah, 22 months later, right? So, but what it does is it delivers those patients back into your office. And if you want to build a dry eye specialty or a dry eye sub area of your practice, we call them pillars. Like, there's nothing better than to know who's going to benefit from IPL or RF or Restasis or Xiidra or Cequa or Mibo, whatever it is, than being forced with a patient who's coming back saying, yeah, this is better, but I'm only about 50% better. And then you're seeing signs of inflammation and staining and stagnant meibomian glands. And you're like, okay, well, I got to do something. You know what I mean? I got to do something else. And so that's, I'll tell you, Eugene, that is, I don't know that anybody, I'm sure other people have thought about it, but it's such a critical part of building that pillar, because you have no other option to get better in those scenarios, is to find something else that's going to work for the patient. Yeah. So anyway, those are the two reasons, one for the patient and one for the doctor.
Yeah. And I think, let's go back to the, how do I know if I'm doing it well? Well, probably it has to do with looking at that prevalence data and then looking at some data inside of your practice. So let's be crystal clear about that. Mm-hmm. Let's talk about the data that everybody should constantly be monitoring the practice. If I had a magical dashboard that I could potentially look at every single day, in your opinion, Chris, what would be on that dashboard?
Well, you'd look at refraction, because that's your wide net. If you think about this from a marketing standpoint, it's your funnel, right? So refractions tell me how many patients I'm seeing who are being delivered in the office for some amount of time, because mostly those patients are, as we've talked about before, the first time a patient enters in, and any time after a year or longer, that patient's going to have a comprehensive exam and refraction. So the denominator has to be the refraction. That tells me how large the pool is. Then we look at disease state. So in this case, if I wanted to look at dry eye as an example, and let's say I didn't have any other fancy stuff, all I have is an anterior segment camera. Maybe all I've invested in is a meibographer, which, by the way, is a fancy anterior segment camera. And I only do that anterior segment imaging when the patient, now it's not, you don't have to do that, but like, let's say that our protocol in our practice, that's not my protocol, by the way, but I'm saying, like, let's say you're going to build a protocol in your practice where you see something during the comprehensive exam, and then you identify it, and you have that patient back for a dry eye evaluation, and the only thing you do is meibography. Well, that has a code, 92285, right? So anterior segment imaging. So meibographer right now, there's a T code, I think, that's still available, but it's not really paid. So it still is recognized as anterior segment imaging. And so in any case, that now becomes a trackable point. So if in my protocol, I'm saying, like, all right, comprehensive exam. I see you back for some 99 code based on whatever you do and whatever your MDM is for that patient or time. But the trackable thing is the anterior segment camera. So now I can say, well, Eugene, you've already told me. So let's say we go out a month, and now our protocol is, I will see you back in 1 month. I will see you back in 1 month. That's part of our vernacular, and that's exactly the habits that we perform in the comprehensive exam. In 2 months, I should be in 2 months later, I should be performing 30, 35 anterior segment imaging for every 100 patients that I saw, if I've done that well.
Right.
And now, if I haven't, well, I can step back and say, well, what did I do wrong? Like, was I not as forceful about the anterior segment, as forceful as I should have been for the ocular surface disease follow-up? Was I, when I say forceful, was I waffling? Did I waffle? Well, maybe we could do this, or maybe we could do that. Or was it just a process problem? Like, you actually saw a lot of those patients for anterior, like, I know I did a lot of, I can go back and look at my schedule. Well, I've seen 30 patients for ocular surface disease. What happened? Well, we didn't bill it. I'll tell you, that happens a ton too. We never billed it. Okay, so you didn't even generate any revenue from it.
I've seen that happen a lot too.
Yeah. Oh, it happens a ton. It happens a ton. And so you can kind of try to pinpoint where the problem is if you've actually are following through with the metric. Or you might say, listen, I have this all the time. Like, should I buy a new widget? Like, I want to buy an IPL. Okay, well, should you buy an IPL? I don't know. How many anterior segment? Do you have an anterior segment camera? Yeah. How many anterior segment images do you do every month? Or even every time your ratio of anterior segment images per refraction? I don't know. Maybe I do it once a week. You're not buying the IPL, right? You're not buying the IPL yet, because you got to use the technology you have. So let's build a process so that you're doing these things. You can show the patient, then that will feed the next thing that you invest in. So that's how you make the numbers work. That's how you understand the numbers, which is why those numbers are important. And you can do the same thing. So let's say I wanted to add testing like osmolarity and inflammatory. So now I'm up to the point where I'm doing 30, right? I'm doing my 30 per 100 refractions. Great. Or maybe it's not even 30, maybe it's 10, right? Like 10 would get you way above most practices. Like, when we look at these numbers, Eugene, most time, like the anterior segment to refraction imaging to refraction ratio is less than 2%. It's less than 2%. Yes. Yes. Wow. And that's with actual practice data. That's like, if you sent me your data and we analyze that data, it's less than 2%. But let's say we get it to 10%. Then I might be saying, okay, Eugene, it's time to add osmolarity and inflammatory. Let's invest in that technology, because every time you're doing the anterior segment camera, now I'm going to do those 2 tests. And by the way, it's not to make more money. It's to take better care of the patient, because now I can be more strategic about what type of ocular surface dysfunction you have and what treatment is most likely to benefit you. Then we run that for another 90 days, right? And this is weird. I've got my ocular surface. I'm doing my anterior segment camera, but I don't have the same number as anterior segment cameras as I have for osmolarity. Why is that? Oh, well, Jenny, who's doing the test, she just stopped doing them, and we never really caught her on doing it. So that it gives you another point to say, like, these 3 should be really closely tied. So my ratio for refractions for each one of those tests now should mirror each other. And when I buy those tests and I implement them into the protocol, I know exactly what to expect, because people will be like, well, how long do you think, rep, I can pay this off? Well, it's like, you don't have to wonder. Like, exactly, like, every ocular surface evaluation, we're going to do these other 2 tests. That means I'm going to bill this many. So I'm going to pay it off in this many months.
Well,
right?
And you're talking about doing it the smart way, because you already have a process to identify those patients. I think a lot of people buy the widget and then say, now I'm going to build the process to identify those patients. And I agree with you 100%. It's the right approach is build the process, identify the patients, make sure you got the patient population, and then after you build the process, buy the widget, because then that'll give you instant ROI, rather than this thing having a really good chance of just sitting in a closet and collecting dust while you wait around to build the process.
Yeah. And you probably have seen the data. I keep quoting 75%, but I think there was a survey recently done about, optometrists who have technology that they purchased within the last so long. Like 75% of them aren't being used, and that's a huge problem. And what do you think that does when you buy something that you think, oh, this is gonna be great for my patients and I'm gonna make a lot of money, and then it sits in the closet? What do you think it does to your identity?
Well, right. It erodes the confidence, right? I mean,
Yeah.
it changes and it puts another block in between you and that mindset that you were
Yeah,
talking about.
absolutely. I'm not the best place for dry eye in my community because I couldn't make IPL work. When Johnny down the street's making it work, or at least I think he is because he's a KOL and he talks on the stage and blah, 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 blah. But, if you look his numbers, actually, and we've looked at some big KOL numbers. I don't share the names, but we've looked at some big KOL numbers and they're not much better than the average OD. They just get a lot of love.
Interesting. And my final kind of perspective on this, Chris, is if you're thinking about numbers and using those numbers to kind of drive adoption of both technology and process in the practice, we did talk about revenue per patient. We talked about revenue per OD hour. Is there any other metric that is highly relevant to a practice that we should potentially be looking at, or any one of these metrics that we've already talked about should be the primary one that we look at outside of, as you mentioned, refractions being the denominator?
Yeah. I mean, I think probably the one that's the most key for me is revenue per OD hour. I mean, I think it just tells you how productive you are. I mean, you can look at like AR and that sort of thing. And I think that's really important, right? But that gets a little bit more nuanced because you can monkey with AR. Like you can have a bad staff that monkeys with AR, right? Oh, it's getting paid, write it off, right? Like that's, but I think the kind of the main driver is got to be revenue per OD hour. It really does.
Yeah, and I think that's a really big point. And if you're not measuring that in your practice, obviously there are mechanisms to do that. And it's not, it's just math, right? Like you just have to be able to keep track of things, and it's just math. But Chris, I really look forward to continuing the conversation. I think we'll probably have one on your show. Tell people how to find you, and I'll put some of the information in the show notes as well.
Yeah, you can find us. We do a weekly podcast. Actually, on our channel, we do a podcast twice a week at iCode Media. You can just search any of your podcast apps, iCode Media. Also, you can find us at iCodeeducation.com. That's EYECODE education.com. Thanks, Eugene, for allowing me to come on.
Yeah, it's definitely a pleasure, and I enjoyed the conversation.
Me too. Thanks.
If you're enjoying the Power Hour, you might be asking yourself, what can I do today in my practice that's going to make an impact? So over the years, the practice coaches and consultants at the Power Practice have helped thousands of practices improve. And they often start with one thing, and that's a proprietary methodology called the Practice Profitability Audit. For about $2,400, they look at all of your practice numbers and they stack them up against where a practice of your size could and should be. It takes about a week for them to do. And because they're so experienced, they know what your potential looks like. And they're often able to take that $2,400, multiply it several times over, and hand it right back to you in found profits in your practice in months, not years, in months. But you get to keep the much more profitable practice for years afterwards. But here's the best news. I'm going to tell you how you can have the Practice Profitability Audit completely free. See, we're really trying to get people onto the show website, which is, by the way, powerpractice.com. And then you click the Power Hour podcast button. The reason we want you there is because I want the audience participation. I want to hear your feedback, and I want to know how to make the show better for you. So you can interact with us, send us your feedback, offer your suggestions. And for a limited time, when you go there, you can also request a practice profitability audit for free. Right. We're going to cover 100% of the cost, but only for 5 people per month. And 5 people per month is all we really have capacity for, because this is a resource intensive audit and the Power Practice coaches are generally busy serving their clients. But for 5 people a month, they've agreed to cover 100% of the cost. So it's totally free to you. So again, take action immediately in your practice. Go to powerpractice.com, click on the Power Hour podcast, interact with us, but also request a practice profitability audit today.